In today's episode, you're going to hear how Mike Brcic transformed a one-off mountain bike trip with friends into a global movement that connects entrepreneurs to their deepest selves and to communities across the world, and why the biggest breakthroughs sometimes come not from doing more, but from being more. Welcome to the Mike Method podcast. My guest today is Mike Brcic, entrepreneur, adventurer, speaker, and founder of Wayfinders. After building and scaling multiple ventures over 27 years, Mike discovered that what truly matters isn't business growth, it's deep human connection. Through his immersive, adventure-based retreats, Mike now helps successful entrepreneurs break through isolation, reconnect with purpose, and forge bonds that last a lifetime. His own journey from battling depression and loneliness to building a global community of heart-centered leaders fuels his mission to create a more connected world. In this conversation, we explore how Wayfinders evolved from a mastermind on mountain bikes to a profound inner journey, the power of cross-cultural exchanges between entrepreneurial leaders and indigenous communities, what ancient wisdom can teach us about navigating modern life, and the personal transformation Mike has experienced through years of global exploration, community building, and plant medicine work. If you've ever felt the tension between doing and being, or long to find more meaning and connection in your life and leadership, this is an episode you don't want to miss. Let's dive in. Mike, I really appreciate you making time to be here today.
I am thrilled, Mike. 2 mics on, talking on a couple of mics.
Right? Exactly. The mic drop, the Mike method, we can use all the Mike euphemisms. So listen, 2018, 2019 were some pretty big years for you, man. You know, major life changes, particularly in what I think you would have thought of as a work transition, but ended up being a whole life transition. So maybe let's start there so that listeners can kind of get a grounding of what was going on for you 2018, 2019, and then we'll kind of roll forward from there.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think the seed was sort of planted in 2017, and that was when I ran my first event with Wayfinders, and it was under a different name back then. But it was really, it wasn't meant to be a business. It wasn't meant to be an ongoing thing. It was just a one-off. I wanted to get a bunch of entrepreneurs together in the Canadian Rockies, ride some mountain bikes, have fun in the outdoors, put the focus on connection, and then do a little bit of, peer sharing, knowledge, wisdom, skill sharing in the evening. And the people loved it. They asked me to do more of them. I had a blast doing it. And so I kept doing more of them. Eventually I discovered I loved it a lot more than my previous company, which I'd been running for about 22 years at the time.
Yeah.
And then in 2019, I sold that company and just so I could go all in on my current company.
So it's interesting that you were in the mountain bike industry, which drove you to wanting to do an event surrounding, taking people out on mountain bikes. And that actually became the birth of your new business.
Yeah. And it was kind of a roundabout story. It was a few guys that you might know, Matt Bertulli and Brad Peterson. They had come back. I had lunch with them, and they had come back. They were living in Toronto at the time, or Ontario, and they had come back from Dan Martell's Maple Summit cat skiing thing with a bunch of other entrepreneurs, and they knew my company, and they said, "Man, you should do something like that. We'll do it in the summer. We'll ride mountain bikes, and then we'll, share knowledge and wisdom." And then I had tea with UJ Ramdas, another entrepreneur, and he had reached out to me and he said, I want to do one of your trips, but I've never mountain biked before. And I said, well, I don't think our off the shelf trips are going to work, but I could put together something custom. Yeah. And then I discovered that these guys knew each other.
Right.
And then I said, hey, why don't we make this a thing? Help me invite a few people out there. I'll put together an incredible, event. So that's how it was born. And, the first event was pretty much all mountain biking, but then my subsequent events, I kind of knew that the Venn diagram of like people who mountain bike and were entrepreneurs and, had the disposable income for this thing was kind of small.
Yeah.
So my subsequent events, we didn't put as much focus on mountain biking. It was more just about exploring and different means and beautiful parts of the world. And it's been coming up on 8 years now. It's been a great ride.
And when you realize that that this was going to be a thing, like, okay, this thing's got some legs to it, and you are falling in love with the concept. Where did the Wayfinders name come from?
Yeah, so it was originally called Mastermind Adventures. And It was, like I said, I didn't have an intention to create a company, but then people asked me to do more events. I was like, okay, well, I should, probably, especially if I'm doing like risky stuff out there, I should at least have some, protection under the banner of a corporation. So it's like, well, it's kind of a mastermind, and we're doing these adventures, and okay, mastermind adventures. I'm on the Colby scale. I'm sure you're familiar with the Colby scale, but I'm a nine quick start, probably more like a 10.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not going to overthink this. It's just like mastermind adventures. And then after a few years, I wasn't really fond of that of that name, mainly because the term mastermind was just so overused. And it's like, if you get together for lunch with your friend, all of a sudden it's a mastermind, or you're walking down the street with somebody and talking about, what business or whatever. Now it's a mastermind. So I kind of got sick of that. And at the time, I wish I had a copy of it. I probably do have a copy of it. There's an amazing book by one of my mentors who lives not too far from me by the name of Wade Davis. You familiar with Wade Davis?
No, I haven't met him.
He is one of the most fascinating humans on the planet. I call him Canada's Indiana Jones.
Okay.
And he's a Harvard-trained ethnobotanist, anthropologist. He's been to, he spent years living in the deepest reaches of the Amazon. He, I think, was the first outsider ever to be invited into a Haitian voodoo ceremony. He's done all these wild and crazy things all over the planet. And he wrote this amazing book called The Wayfinders. And the subtitle of that book is Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World. Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World. And it's a collection of stories from his travels around the globe about these ancient cultures and why their ways of being and why their wisdom is still relevant. And not only relevant in the modern world, but really desperately needed. And the actual wayfinders he quotes in the book are these Polynesian navigators who, if you look at Polynesia, this vast area of hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean with these islands that are sometimes separated by as much as 500 miles from each other, the odds of those islands getting colonized, leaving your island and just hopping in a small little outrigger canoe and paddling 500 miles to hit this tiny little speck are so infinitesimally low. And so he was curious about, like, how did this possibly happen? And then he spent time with these people who were called wayfinders, and they have these incredible ways of navigating without modern navigation or compasses, of reading waves, of reading clouds, of reading movement of fish, all these things. And so that was sort of, his metaphor of these ancient ways of being they're still very useful. And I was reading that and I thought, that's really what I'm kind of trying to do for people, is help them find their own internal compass. And I just love that. And so I reached out to Wade and I said, hey, I'm thinking of rebranding my company. Would you give me your blessing with this? And we had been in contact a few times before that. And he said, absolutely, I love it. And so that's where the new name was born. And I love it. It encapsulates what I do quite nicely.
That's such a beautiful testament to your mentor, and really the perfect name for what your business has actually become. So let's talk about from the inception, right? So we start off with it being an offshoot of your existing business. You end up selling that business, rebranding it to Wayfinders. And then as we move forward to today, what did you think this business was versus what did you discover it has become?
Yeah, great question. I love that. I think what I thought it was, and what it was in the early years, was I was going to I was going to a lot of entrepreneur conferences. I was aggressively scaling my previous company. And, as you may know, when you aggressively scale a company, you start to hit greater levels of complexity, and you often find yourself lacking in the skill set for this new level of the company. So I started, I joined EO, I started attending these different events where I could connect with other entrepreneurs who had already done what I was doing. And I love the events. There was so much useful information, but the value I got was the people that I met. And they weren't really set up. If there's somebody talking on stage and then you go straight into a workshop, you can't talk to somebody else while you're listening to somebody on stage unless you want to be really rude. And so I wanted to create something where the focus was on connection, and the connection coming through, being active, having time doing fun, challenging things together, but also have a little bit of business kind of thing in there, right? So we would have workshops in the afternoon, evening, and it was very business focused. And, after about a year and a half, I started going to destinations farther afield, went to Fiji and Patagonia. I did an event in Bhutan. And I noticed that the farther away I took people and the farther out of their typical environment, and the more different the environment, the culture, the people were, the greater the impact of the event, because it was taking people out of their day to day, and it was giving them an opportunity to kind of reflect on life, a pause from the day-to-day, and an opportunity to be surrounded by other cultures that have a very different interpretation of how to live a meaningful life. Not that they're better or worse, it's just exposure to different ideas. And I started hearing from people that, in addition to the business value of connecting with other entrepreneurs. There was this aspect of personal growth and clarity and direction that they were getting from these events. And so I thought, and my last pre-COVID event was Bhutan in November 2019. And I had started leaning in that direction. And then my next event was scheduled for Peru in the Amazon with Wade Davis, who's going to be my speaker. And that was scheduled for early April 2020. So we know how that went.
Right.
And so that event had to get postponed. And then I had this big pause. And, luckily I had this very loyal clientele, most of whom I knew intimately, and nobody was asking me for refunds. I was doing well financially. I didn't have to panic or anything like that. And so I had this big long pause, and I decided to really lean into developing my facilitation skills. And so I took all these trainings that were, being offered, and then finally got to run my first post-COVID event or during COVID event in September of 2021 in Greenland. And with that event, I decided to really lean into that aspect of like, let's create an emotional, psychological, spiritual journey that, that mirrors the physical journey that we're undertaking through these landscapes. And so that's continued to this day, just trying to create an environment where there's adventure and there's challenge. There's also reflection time. There's also time for personal development exercises, and there's lots of time for deep connection. And these things kind of all weave into each other and support each other so that, if we're doing an exercise that invites you to be vulnerable and open, and you're sharing this with other people, that level of vulnerability is going to continue through your conversations, which is, our mutual friend, Philip McKernan, likes to say, relationships move at the speed of vulnerability. And so it creates an environment for deep connection. So it's kind of become this, not very different thing, but substantially different thing from what it started out as being.
What I find also interesting is as you discuss the format, that's the individual event. And what I think, what I've seen occur is that you actually built a community, because there are people that have been to a number of your Wayfinders adventures and keep going back for the next one. And so you've actually built a community in and around Wayfinders. Was that always the intention, or was that something that just sort of occurred as you kept doing more events?
I would like to take credit for that being my intention. And maybe it was accidentally my intention, but the intention was not that different from my previous company. And I always believed the best marketing is to just have an amazing product.
Right.
So I put incredible amounts of time and energy and training and skill into designing these events and being super meticulous about, thinking about every moment of every day, thinking about the emotional journey that people are going through. And what happened was people just raved about it. They loved it, and they wanted to keep coming back. For my typical client who's, hard charging, driven entrepreneur, to be able to come to an event where they can stop, any pretending or posturing or whatever, and they can just show up and be real, and they can talk about, typically people will talk about anything but business at my events. They have plenty of places where they can talk about business, but they don't have as many places where they can talk about, they're struggling with their mental health or their relationships or, whatever that may be, or, their company's on the verge of bankruptcy, because in a lot of environments where the focus is on business and there's a lot of, business growth kind of environments, there's this tendency to want to show that you're just kicking ass on all fronts. Right? and so I think that combination of all these different elements for the right person, and it's definitely not for everybody, but for the right person, they just really love it and they want to keep coming back. And so when people keep coming back, it inevitably creates a community. And so, my most recent event was in Papua New Guinea, and it was 25 people. 24 of them were returning clients, and then the one new person was just because somebody canceled last minute, and he took their spot. And so when we all met in Brisbane, it was like this big reunion, and some people are staying in touch, but some people haven't seen each other since the last one a year ago, whatever. And it's just this big hug fest. And I love that it's become a community, and there's so much that happens outside of the events informally, and it's beautiful, and I love it.
And then you take the community that's around that, And then you're taking your community of those 25 people and you're bringing them into communities in Papua New Guinea, in Bhutan, and all the various places that you've traveled. So what's that experience of taking a community and bringing it into another community like? Because you're basically bringing two communities together to be in dialogue, to be in experience with each other. So it's not just that the people that are traveling are transformed, but there must be an effect on the community that you're going to visit as well. And what's that experience been like?
Yeah. It's beautiful in a nutshell, and I'll tell you why. I spent a lot of time scouting my events and developing really unique experiences, typically ones that have never been done before. So to give you an example, when I ran my first Mongolia event, and I'm heading back there in October, we met in Ulaanbaatar, and then we flew to Ulgi, which is Mongolia has this highway that traverses most of the length of the country, and Ulgi is the end of the line, as far west as you can go, thousands of kilometers later. We flew there. I wasn't going to subject them to the 35-hour drive, but
Right.
We flew there, and then we got into these Russian military vehicles, drove another 4 hours to about as far west as you can go in Mongolia. You hit the Altai Mountains, which is where China and Russia and Kazakhstan and Mongolia all meet. And we met up with a local nomad family there, and we spent a few days with them in their fall camp, and then we accompanied them on their fall migration down to their winter camp. And nobody had ever done that before in that region. And, tourists, if any tourists come into the area, they check out the Eagle Festival in September, and then they leave. But this was a 9-day deep immersion into the nomad way of life, and, living with this family and this whole camp of locals who were supporting our journey. And it was this magical experience. And it was magical because we had never done anything like that before. This local family had certainly not, and the locals who were supporting us. And they were just as curious about us as we were with them. And we had, these beautiful interactions. We're helping the family milk their yaks, where the big thing the Kazakhs do in that region is wrestling, the men at least. And so we would have like daily wrestling matches with the locals, and we would get our asses kicked, as you can imagine. But it was beautiful. And then when we were, meeting at night in our gurs, which is the local word for yurt, we'd have dinner, and then, a lot of the drivers and the camp staff were musicians, and they would play, they would come and play their traditional songs for us. And they're just like the most hauntingly beautiful songs. And there's this beautiful exchange of cultures and of knowledge, and very much a two-way street, because they were curious about us as well. And more recently, we were in quite a remote community in Papua New Guinea, where we spent 3 days and 2 nights living with them. And same thing, like they had over the years, had a handful of, a couple will come and spend a night, or a group of 3 or 4 people will come, and they have this little guest house there. But they built this a couple of brand new guest houses for us, and a few of the families opened up their homes to us, and we lived with them for 3 days. And the beautiful thing about Papua New Guinea is that even in these remote communities, because the missionaries were so active and are so active in Papua New Guinea, for better or for worse, but a lot of locals there speak English. And so you can go to, this village where people still live much like they would have 500 years ago, and very traditionally, and still, they still have their traditional outfits. They don't wear them every day, but they wear them for ceremonies and stuff like that. And we can have a very meaningful conversation with them in English, which is an amazing thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just share one final story about that. This woman who was on the trip, we were having our dinner, and we had spent a few hours that day, and I put our people in pairs, and then paired them with people from the community, and they did a little walking around the community, and they're sharing their lives, we're sharing our lives with them. And this woman from our group was sitting around at dinner, and she had spent the afternoon with this older woman, and her face was completely tattooed in these traditional tattoos, and she looks like she could be on the cover of National Geographic. And she went into this interaction thinking, what am I going to talk about with this woman? Her life is so radically different from mine.
Right.
And she said they just chatted for hours, and she said, like, I couldn't believe just how much we had in common. At the root, like, as humans, we all want the same things. We want to be loved. We want to love, we want to hold our loved ones. We want them to be safe. We want security, all these things. And they just met on this very beautiful human level. So that's my long answer to your question, which is that these interactions with these communities are so beautiful and rich. And also, I think because of the spirit that my community brings to these villages, where it's not like, I'm going to take a few photos of you and treat you like, a curiosity that
Right.
I'm going to the zoo, but it's like, hey, let's really get to know each other. I'm curious about you, and let me tell you a bit about my life. And people really appreciate that.
That's such a different connection, as you say, to somebody who's a tourist who's sort of coming in and sees a traditional garb or sees a local musical act or dance and says, okay, I did my video, I took my pictures, I'm on, now I'm off to the next attraction, whatever the next thing is, versus being immersed in the culture and getting an opportunity to actually understand the daily life. As you say, at our core, we're all human beings, right? So getting that opportunity to understand the commonalities as opposed to walking in and seeing the differences. And I think that's such a beautiful thing that has occurred as a result of you bringing those two communities together. How's this changed you? Like, you've had these incredible experiences. Again, you're getting both, right? Like you're in these communities that you've put together, but you're going ahead of time and meeting the communities and getting to know them. Then you're putting those two communities together with such deep thoughtfulness and intentionality that doing that for this length of time, it must have changed you. And I'm curious what that transformation has been like for you.
Yeah, I love that question. And three things come to mind for me, three sort of different threads. And one is that these experiences have exposed me to all these different ways of being, all these different interpretations of living a human life, and they're wildly different. If I think about our nomad friends in Mongolia, it's this, deep, deep connection to the land and to their animals. If I think about the monks of Bhutan I've spent time with, it's this incredible stillness and reverence for contemplation and the inner life, being versus doing, so to speak. And each of these different cultures exposes me to something different, and I take away something from each of them that informs my life here in Toronto. And it's not that I want to become a monk, no desire to become a monk, but I do take away something from that about the value of stillness and realizing that I don't always need to be doing in order to have value as a human being. I don't need to always be doing in order to contribute to the world. And just to double click on that a little bit, in Bhutan is this tiny little landlocked nation in the Himalayas. I think about 700,000 people. Monasteries all over the country, usually high up in the mountain. It's a Buddhist nation. There are, if a monk is following the path, at a certain point they get the option to go into retreat. Mm-hmm. And they will go into a cave or a hut for typically about 3 years in solitude with, their only interaction is somebody bringing them food, but they don't even interact with that person. The food is brought to them. So they're in, basically solitary confinement for 3 years, but, and sometimes longer, 6-9 years. These are some of the most joyous, content, happy people I've ever met. And there's something about the energy of being in a country where there's thousands of monks. And while they're there, they are meditating, but they're also praying for the well-being of all sentient beings. And there's something magical about being in a country where there's thousands of people sitting alone, just praying for everybody's well-being. Mm-hmm. And so that's an example of how, you look at that and you think, are those, we could, a productivity expert could argue that they're not doing anything productive, but you can feel that. And, I don't know, how you measure that or whatever, but it definitely feels productive, but just in a very different way. And so that's one aspect, is these cultures teach me something. The other is the friendships that I've developed with the most unlikely people. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, if you told me 10 years ago that I would have a friendship with a Batwa pygmy from Uganda and that we would be in regular conversation, be like, I don't think so. That sounds kind of weird. But I developed this wonderful relationship with, and the backstory of the Batwa people is that in the early 90s, the Ugandan government created a national park in southwestern Uganda called Windy Impenetrable Forest in order to protect the mountain gorillas who were going extinct. The gorillas are this wonderful success story. I think their numbers have tripled since then because, very heavily protected against poaching now. But this part of the story that isn't told is that in order to do so, the Ugandan government kicked, I think, about 200 or 300 Batwa people out of the forest. And these are hunter-gatherers who lived, basically a Stone Age life, gave them a piece of land and said, okay, you're farmers now. And they said, what? We're farmers? We don't know how to farm. Like, right. We eat bushmeat and berries and stuff like that. And so the Batwas have had a very rough go of it. And I developed, my first scouting trip there, I developed a relationship with the Batwa people there and I've now been back 2 more times since and have deepened that relationship. And and I have supported their community. But the first time I went there, I asked the leader of the community, like, what is it your people really need? What would make the biggest difference? And she said, land. We need more land. We don't have enough land. And so when we visited, I asked the group if they, and we spent the day with them, had an amazing day with them. And then asked the group, this is what they need. Would anybody care to contribute? And collectively they contributed, I think, about $15, which on the spot, which was enough to buy them a few acres of land. And then when I went back a year ago to run another event there, and because things move so slowly in Uganda, it wasn't until a year later that the right piece of land was found and that it was transferred. And we attended the transfer ceremony and the whole community came out and we had this amazing day of dancing and singing. And they were just, so thankful that we were able to provide that for them. And so I've maintained this ongoing relationship. And then that group that came contributed another $15,000 to help buy tools and seeds and training and all this kind of stuff. So I developed these amazing relationships with the unlikeliest of people. And me and William, who's one of the leaders of that community, are a regular touch on WhatsApp. And he's just this tiny little guy, maybe like 4'2".
Yeah.
He's got the biggest smile you've ever seen. And, his life is incredibly simple, often very poor, but he's just one of the most joyous people I've ever met. And we have this wonderful connection. And so that's my second answer. And my third answer to your question is that in order to effectively lead this community, I recognized early on that I had to up-level myself as a leader, and that there were all sorts of blind spots, all sorts of blocks and whatever that prevented me from being the leader that I could be, the leader that could most effectively serve this community. And so it sent me on this journey of really, examining who I am, doing my inner work, investing in my growth in order to not just to serve that community. Part of it is also I want to live a better life, and that's a meaningful path towards it, but also to serve this community. And so that's been a beautiful journey.
One of the things that you said about productivity really struck me in that you said, there's people going away in solitude for 3, 6, 9 years, that we wouldn't look at that and that the act of an entire country praying for humanity, we would look at that from, say, Western philosophy and say, where's the productivity in that? How would you measure productivity? And you talked about, the difference between doing and being. And it reminded me of a quote that a friend of mine, Dan Ponifract, has, which is that we are not human doings, we are human beings. Mm-hmm. And it feels like that, you've had the experience of being in cultures who really understand their true humanness, irrespective of what they do, whether they're a hunter-gatherer or they're a farmer or, whatever the thing is, they're a monk. In all of these communities, it sounds like there is a deep connection to pure humanness, which I think is something that's easier to let go of when we're in sort of Western culture and we think about productivity and what we're going to accomplish and what does success mean, and, the current fascination with hustle culture and all of these things. And to bring people that are pretty much mired in that environment to go and witness and be in community in the most human way possible. And then for you to understand that the responsibility of your own growth through that mission so that you can be able to be there with both communities, because you have a responsibility to both communities, which is rare, right? Like if you think a tour guide has got to respond, they're responsible for their tourists and they're going to take them around and do their thing. That's like traditional sort of tourism. And you are bringing communities together around the world and have this deep responsibility for both. So the growth that I hear you talking about that you recognize you need to have is to support all the communities that you engage and evolve with.
Yeah. There's a wonderful South African philosophy called Ubuntu. Have you ever heard of Ubuntu?
I have not. I'd love to hear more.
Bishop Tutu was sort of the most ardent proponent of this philosophy of Ubuntu. And I believe whether it was his shorthand for explaining it or maybe somebody else's, but the shorthand for it is I am because we are.
Wow.
And it's this notion that everybody lives within a complex web of relationships. And it's that web of relationships that defines us, not this individual I that we talk about, but this we. And that philosophy is spread all over South Africa. It's very much alive in Uganda. Uganda is one of the poorest nations on earth. And most people would have a very hard time surviving without this web of relationship of people looking after looking after each other. And I think part of that, it's less to me about this idea of responsibility and more this idea of interconnectedness. And that if I'm taking care, if I'm helping to take care or helping to support this community on the other side of the world, I'm also helping to support myself in the process. And one of the most beautiful, not example, but just manifestations of this was in the Peruvian Amazon, spending time with this local shaman. And I think his name was Don Eduardo, I want to say, but he studied for about 25 years before he felt he was ready to call himself a shaman. And, people hear the word shaman and they immediately think of ayahuasca.
Sure.
And it's like, that's a shaman's role. For most shamans, maybe a part of their role, but it's not the sum total of their role. And his role was to really understand this whole web of interconnectedness. And so walking through the jungle with him, he could not only tell you about every single ant and beetle and leaf and animal in that jungle, of which there are, thousands, tens of thousands, but he could tell you how that particular ant or leaf exists in relationship to everything around it. And how they're inseparable. They are not, discrete entities, but everything is connected, including himself. And he saw himself as intricately connected to this jungle, as a part of this jungle, not as a separate being, but as this, a different sort of expression of that same jungle or that same consciousness. And so when you bring that level of consciousness to the world, you inevitably want to take care of the Amazon. You want to take care of that beetle. You want to take care of the people in your community. You want to take care of people in communities elsewhere. And so that's something I'm striving towards. I still 99.99% of the time, still very much see myself as a discrete individual, and my ego takes over and whatever. But I try to bring myself back and remember that I'm just connected to everyone and everything. So why wouldn't I try to expand my sphere of concern, as it were?
It fits the Stoic principle as well, which is, what's good for the village is good for the individual. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, this kind of me first thing that has been occurring, whether it's on social media or in society, has moved us away from that. And, fundamentally as human beings, we're wired for connection. In fact, if we weren't connected, if we go far enough back in time, falling out of favor with the tribe meant death. Like there was no way to survive unless you were connected to a tribe of some sort, because you relied so heavily on the resources of your village and your tribe to be able to function. And without that, if you're ostracized, it was death.
Yeah. And we developed this complex system of neurochemicals that binds us to others.
Right.
In that web, in response to that. And, whether it's oxytocin or serotonin, there's all these things operating in our brain that bind us to others. And then when we live separately from others or too separately from others, we go into all sorts of dysregulation. Mm-hmm. Because we're meant to be in relationship with others, and we're meant to care for others, and we're meant to spend time with others. So yeah, these are just some of the beautiful lessons that this work has given me over the years.
So as part of this journey of self-exploration, you mentioned ayahuasca as one of the tools that a shaman has in their toolkit. But as part of this, your journey towards self-exploration, I'd love to know if you would mind sharing your medicine journey and how that has helped to inform the self-exploration journey you've been on.
Yeah, I actually, I have a long history with psychedelic drugs, going back to my 20s when I joined them. I enjoyed them quite a lot recreationally. And, if my kids end up listening to this one day, use them responsibly if you're going to use them.
Yeah.
Please. But these medicines are incredible tools for expanding consciousness. And my first sort of intentional, growth experience with medicines was actually after, I'm not going to name the event. It was after an event, and somebody that I knew. I was actually reading Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind.
Yeah, great book.
And then, great book.
Yeah.
And then this person, I got a Facebook message from this person who was going to the same conference and said, "I'm putting together this, experience after with one of the leading practitioners in the US. Do you want to join?" And I was like, seems to be some signs here as I'm reading this book. And that first one was quite a profound experience. And it was, I think, about 12 of us who did that deeply profound experience. And I've probably had, somewhere between 15 and 20 guided experiences. Since sometimes it's, I will self-administer, and I will have a friend sit with me just to, look over me, make sure I'm okay. Sometimes it's with an actual, guide or facilitator, and they will administer the medicine, and it's a very intentional journey, and I'm paying somebody. Sometimes I'll just do it on my own completely, at a lower dose. But really, what this work does for me is it helps me see the stories that that I've written or that have been written for me that kind of limit me from living in full expression, and gives me an opportunity to rewrite some of these stories. And I will say, and I just wrote a post about this recently, I think about 10% of the work, 10% of the benefit is in the journey itself. The other 90% is in what you do with it after. I would say maybe more like 5 and 95%, because I know people who've done 40 ayahuasca journeys and they don't really appear to be fundamentally changed, and they're still struggling with a lot of the same things. And you can have a deeply profound, powerful experience, and it tells you all sorts of useful things, and then you do nothing with it. And it's sort of like the portal briefly opens, and then and it's your responsibility when that portal is open to walk through it and live differently, and make the courageous choices and write the new stories. And so I've always tried to take the integration piece seriously. One of the things I often do is I really trust the medicine, and I try to follow up as quickly as I can on some of the downloads without making any drastic changes, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm not gonna like sell my company because mushrooms spoke to me last night. But there is often useful information in there. Usually when a journey ends, I will write stuff down, or I'll dictate in a voice note, and I will try to act on a lot of that stuff as quickly as possible, because I trust it, and I feel it's coming from a deeper place, whether it's my soul or my inner psyche, or the universe or God speaking to me or whatever, who knows. But I trust that place where it's coming from. And I know that the longer I wait, the more my ego is going to take over and say, no, don't trust that. That's, and it'll come up with all sorts of logical reasons why that's total gobbledygook. But then when I trust it and follow up, sometimes the most magical things happen, the most, incredible synchronicities. And so it continues to be part of my path, but it's not the only modality I use. Sometimes it can be as simple as journaling and just seeing what my subconscious has to say to me on a given day. And sometimes it's just the act of practicing, something that I learned in a journey 3 years ago.
I love about your shared experience there is, I've spoken to a lot of people who have come to me and asked me about going down the journey. Ironically, my first journey with my wife occurred a year after yours with this, for the same reason, because I was invited by the same person as a result of the same conference to go do the second version of what you experienced.
I heard all about that.
Yeah. And it was, because all the people that were there, right? And it was beautiful. But I'll tell you what really struck me is that one of the individuals that was there when we were sharing, and I won't share names obviously, but they were sharing their experience, and they said that they really struggled because they got the same message they got a year ago. They'd done the experience a year ago. They came back a year later, and the medicine told them the same thing. And for those of you, when we say the medicine told them the same thing, the best way I could describe this type of plant medicine experience that Mike and I are talking about is it's effectively, depending on your religious belief, you're talking to your soul, the universe, or God. One of those three things is able to put words to something that is very difficult for words to be put to. At least that's the best way I've come up with describing it. And this person was sharing to me that they got the same message. And the guide said, "What have you done since the last experience?" And their response was, and the guide said, "You'll keep getting the message until you're willing to do the work." And I'm sitting there with my first experience going, I'm doing the work. Like, I don't want to come back. When I decide to come back, I don't want to get the same message again. And so the integration, as I went through my integration, I realized two things. One, being so clear on the intention going in and putting the time and energy in to understanding what my intention did mattered. That and the integration after mattered so much more than the ceremony itself and whatever modality, whether it was, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, 5-MeO, DMT. There are so many different peyote. There's all these different ways you can experience the medicine, but with clear intent and an open heart and an open mind going in, and then a willingness to do the work. And as you say, to do the work as soon as you can, because I also had the experience of, I could hear my ego saying, oh, it's probably fine the way it is. Yeah, sure, it came up, but you don't really need to do something. I'm like, wow, that's fast. Like, within a month that was there. And I'm like, okay, I've got to act on these things and make the changes. And, the changes were so foundational and fundamental to my marriage, to how I show up as a father, how I show up as a leader, how I show up as a friend, a family member. I'm a different person in a wonderful way. And I just wanted to underscore your comment about how powerful and how important that integration is. Because I think that when people go into it, they get so fixated on what the plant medicine is. And then, yes, the guide's important. Yes, the set and setting are really important. You need to feel psychologically safe. You need to have somebody who's experienced, who can be there with you through the experience. You need to have set yourself up for success with your intention. With all that being true, the most important part happens after the medicine wears off, and you are left there with either the recording, the journal, as you mentioned, as I've done as well, both recorded my narration of it during, and also my notes. And it's scary sometimes to do the integration work, because sometimes they're difficult conversations, or conversations that I've been avoiding that are really, I'm stuck. And I can't unstick myself, whether it's in relationship or in those areas of my life, unless I'm willing to do the work.
Yeah. And you use the word sometimes. In my experience, it's usually. Yeah. Usually the medicine is pointing you to a difficult decision or conversation, right, one that you have been avoiding. And so I often like to say, the medicine isn't the path, it's the flashlight. All it's doing is illuminating the path. And then you have to decide if you're going to walk it or not. You can still illuminate the path all you fucking want, and it's as clear as day. And it's like, I'm not going to walk it. And so this, and I'll just underscore your underscore. This happened to me very recently. I want to say maybe about 3 months ago. And I had booked a session with a local facilitator, a fairly advanced medicine. I don't know how, powerful medicine, I guess. And it was a Monday, and we had our intake interview, our call. And he asked me, have you had experience with this medicine before? And I said, yeah, about 7 months ago. And he said, tell me about that. So I told him about it. And then I told him about this, this vision or whatever, which was leading me towards a difficult conversation with a family member. And he said, okay, so have you had that conversation? And I said, no. And he said, well, with all due respect, it sounds like you have some unfinished homework here. And, I will still host this ceremony for you on Friday. But it doesn't feel right to me to be doing that when you haven't really done the major thing that it pointed to you last time. And I said, I invite you to consider having that before Friday. And I was like, damn it. This is like a conversation that was 30 years in the making that should have. And so Thursday morning, I went and had that conversation. And it was maybe 10% as difficult as I had made it out to be, and it had become this giant monster and it was not hard, and it was very healing. And so, it's easy, even if you are very used to doing this work, whether it's this or whether it's therapy or whatever, right? It's like we all accumulate these sediment that we have to sift through, and we have to make these hard decisions. We have to have these courageous conversations. Otherwise, we remain stuck. And thankfully, I've gotten to the point where I've realized that a lot of the times these decisions or conversations aren't as hard as I've made them out to be. And so it's kind of like building up that muscle of doing the hard thing. And it just gets easier every time. And then the more I do it, the more it leads me in the direction of the life that I want to live.
Mike, I really appreciate you being here on the podcast today to share not only the journey that you've been on with Wayfinders, but the personal journey that you've been on right alongside the growth of your business and the communities you're creating with such authenticity and vulnerability. Thank you for being here, my friend.
Thank you for having me.